"You don't get to say no to me, Dad. Not after everything." Those were the first words my son said to me that Tuesday morning. Not hello, not how are you. He walked into my kitchen, poured himself a cup of my coffee without asking, and said that, like I owed him something, like 58 years of my life had been building toward the moment I handed over what little I had left. Let me back up. My name is Gene Calloway. I'm 61 years old, and I spent 32 of those years working for the same trucking company outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. Started as a loader when I was 19, bad back. Worse pay, no complaints. Worked my way up to dispatcher, then regional coordinator. Nothing glamorous, nobody was writing stories about me. But I showed up. Every single day I showed up. My wife, Darlene, and I had 2 kids. Our son, Trevor, and our daughter, Pam. Darlene passed from ovarian cancer 11 years ago, and I want you to understand something about that. It didn't break me because I didn't let it. I had 2 kids who needed a father who was still standing, and so I stayed standing. I grieved at night when they couldn't see me, and I made breakfast in the morning when they could. Pam turned out just fine. She's a physical therapist now, lives in Chattanooga, calls me every Sunday without fail. She got her mother's kindness and, thankfully, her mother's common sense. Trevor is a different story. Not going to pretend I don't carry some of the blame for how Trevor turned out. I know I do. When Darlene was sick, I worked more hours than I should have. Overtime, weekend shifts. I told myself it was for the medical bills, and that was true. But it was also easier than sitting in that house watching her fade. Trevor was 15. He needed more of me than I gave him. I know that. I've sat with that knowledge for a long time. But I also know that a man can acknowledge his mistakes without writing a blank check to cover every bad decision his child makes afterward. After Darlene passed, I started putting money aside. Not for myself. I've never cared much about things. I drive a 20 Ford F-150 and I eat dinner at the same diner on Route 11 every Friday. No, the money was for the kids, and for a piece of property I'd bought years before. A small fishing cabin on Norris Lake. 3 acres, 2 bedrooms, a dock that needed constant fixing, worth maybe $400,000 by the time all this happened, depending on who you asked. To me, it was worth more than that. Darlene and I spent our first anniversary there. We took the kids there every summer until she couldn't make the drive anymore. That cabin was the last place I still felt close to her. Trevor knew that. That's the part that still sits in my chest like a stone. He'd been struggling financially for years. And I say struggling the way you might describe a man who keeps lighting his own house on fire and then wondering why he's cold. Trevor had a talent for making money and a greater talent for losing it. A restaurant in 2017 that folded after 8 months. A consulting business that consulted on nothing for anyone. A real estate partnership with a college buddy that ended with lawyers involved. Each time, I helped, not always with money, sometimes with co-signing, sometimes with phone calls to people I knew, sometimes just with keeping my mouth shut when I wanted to say what I actually thought. His wife Britt was sweet. I want to say that clearly. She was a kindergarten teacher from Maryville, and she worked hard, and she loved my son in a way he didn't deserve. And I think some part of her knew that. But she stayed anyway because that's the kind of woman she was. They had a daughter together, my granddaughter, Lily Rose, who was 5 years old at the time all this happened, and who is the single greatest argument I know for the existence of something good in this world. In the spring of 2 years ago, Trevor called to tell me he and Britt were renewing their vows. 10 years together, he said. Wanted to do something special. I thought that was genuine nice. I told him so. Then he told him so. Then he told me the date. It was the same weekend as my retirement party. 32 years at the company, and my colleagues had planned a dinner. Nothing grand, just the people I'd worked alongside for decades at a steakhouse in Knoxville. They'd been canning it for 2 months. Trevor knew about it. I'd mentioned it to him at least 3 times. I told him about the conflict. Gently, I thought. He told me I could reschedule my retirement party. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Trevor, I can't ask 30 people to rearrange their plans." He said, "Then I guess you're choosing your co-workers over your family." That was the beginning of it. I went to my retirement party. I had a good time. My supervisor, a woman named Carla who'd put up with my nonsense for over a decade, gave a speech that made me tear up a little. I drove home feeling, for the first time in a long time, like I'd done something right. I did not attend the vow renewal. I sent a card and a check for $500. Trevor didn't cash the check. He sent it back in an envelope with no note. We didn't speak for 4 months after that. When he finally called, I answered. Because I'm his father, and I always answer. He didn't apologize. He just started talking the way he does, filling the air with words until the silence that should hold an apology gets crowded out. I let him do it. We found a kind of surface-level peace, and I told myself that was enough for now. Then, this past October, he showed up at my door on a Tuesday morning. He'd driven 2 hours from Nashville, where he and Britt had moved the previous year. He knocked once, then walked in using the spare key I'd given him for emergencies. He poured my coffee. And then he said those words, "You don't get to say no to me, Dad, not after everything." I asked him to sit down. He didn't. He stood in the middle of my kitchen with his arms crossed like he was negotiating a business deal, which, I'd come to understand, was exactly what he thought this was. He needed the cabin, not to visit, not to borrow for a weekend. He wanted me to sign it over to him, deed it to him outright, or at minimum take out a home equity loan on it and give him the cash. Somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000, he said, like the range made it more reasonable. I asked him why. He'd started another business, food distribution this time, supplying local restaurants with specialty ingredients. It had actually been going well, he said, for almost 18 months. But he'd over-leveraged, taken on a warehouse lease he couldn't sustain, had a client pull out of a contract last minute. Now he owed money he didn't have, and the bank wasn't interested in his situation. And if he didn't come up with capital in the next 60 days, he'd lose everything. He said all of this quickly, the way people do when they've rehearsed a practical part so they don't have to slow down on the emotional part. I listened to the whole thing. Then I said, "What does Britain think about you coming here?" Something moved across his face. "She doesn't know." I nodded slowly. "Trevor, that cabin is the last thing your mother and I—" "Don't do that." His voice went sharp. "Don't bring Mom into this." "I'm not bringing her into it. She's already in it. That's the point." He looked away, out the window. There was a silence between us that had years in it. Then he said, "You were never there when I needed you. When Mom was sick, you were never there. You owe me. You've owed me for a long time, and this is me finally asking to collect. I want to tell you that I stayed calm. I did, mostly, but I won't lie and say those words didn't land. They landed. I've thought about those years too. I've regretted them. But there's a difference between a debt of the heart and the deed to a property, and my son was trying to make them the same thing. I told him I needed time to think. He said he didn't have time to give me. I told him he'd have to find some anyway. He left. He didn't take the coffee cup to the sink. He just left it there on the counter and walked out. And I stood in my kitchen for a long time after I heard his truck pull out of the driveway. I didn't sleep much that week. I went over it from every angle, the way you do when you're trying to be fair to someone, even when fairness is costing you something. I thought about Darlene. I thought about what she would have said. I knew exactly what she would have said, actually. She would have said, "Gene, you cannot keep catching him. He has to learn to land." She used to say things like that. Darlene had a clarity about people that I always envied and never quite managed myself. I drove out to the cabin on a Thursday, just to sit there. I hadn't been since the previous spring. The dock needed work again. 2 boards had warped over the winter. The lake was grey and still, and there was a great blue heron standing at the water's edge, like it owned the place. I sat on the steps of the porch and drank coffee from a thermos, and I thought about my life. I thought about what it meant to hold on to something versus what it meant to let something go. Those aren't always opposites. Sometimes the thing you hold on to isn't the thing you think it is. The cabin wasn't Darlene, I knew that. Darlene was in Pam's laugh, and in Lily Rose's eyes, and in a box of letters in my closet that I haven't been able to read yet, and probably never will. The cabin was just wood and water. But it wasn't Trevor's wood and water. Not yet. And maybe not ever. I made some calls that week. Quietly. First to my accountant, a man named Phil, who's been doing my taxes for 20 years and who I trust more than almost anyone. Then to a lawyer, an estate attorney named Catherine, who came recommended by a woman at my church. Then, after those conversations, I made one more call. To a man I'd met through a volunteer program at the Norris Lake Community Center about 4 years earlier. His name was Don Whitfield. He ran an organization called Lakeside Hope, a residential program for teenagers aging out of the foster care system. 18-year-olds who had nowhere to go when they turned 18. The organization had a small facility near the lake, but they'd been looking for space to expand, a place where the kids could work outdoors, learn to maintain property, have somewhere quiet to think. I'd donated money to Lakeside Hope before. Small amounts here and there. I knew what Don did with every dollar. I told Don I want to talk. We met at a diner. Different diner than my usual Friday one. This felt like it needed neutral ground. I told him about the cabin. About its condition, its acreage, the dock. I told him I was considering donating it to Lakeside Hope as a permanent facility. Not a loan, not a temporary arrangement. A full transfer of the deed. Don is not a man who gets emotional easily. He's a practical, quiet person who spent 15 years in social work before starting the organization. He looked at me across the table for a long moment, and then he said, "Gene, are you sure?" I told him I was sure about the what. I was still working through the why. He told me to take the time I needed. I called Trevor the following Tuesday. I told him I had an answer for him. He drove back up. Same kitchen table. He looked tired, which I noticed, and which I let myself feel something about before I set that feeling aside. I told him I wasn't going to give him the cabin or take out a loan against it. He started to talk. I held up my hand. I told him I'd made arrangements to donate the cabin to a non-profit organization that works with foster youth in the area. The paperwork was already in progress with Catherine. It was done, or nearly done. There was nothing to negotiate. The look on his face went through several things in about 4 seconds. Disbelief. Then anger. Then something that might have been hurt, though it was hard to distinguish from wounded pride. "You're giving it away," he said. "To strangers. To kids who have nobody," I said. That felt right. "And I'm your son?" "Yes," I said. "You are." He said I was punishing him. I told him I wasn't. That was true. I hadn't done this to punish him. I'd done it because I'd sat on a porch on Norris Lake and watched a heron stand at the edge of the water, and I'd understood something about what I was supposed to do with the time I had left. "Those kids don't have a father," I said. "They don't have anyone to catch them. You do. You have me, and you have Britt, and you have a little girl who thinks you hung the moon. You have more than you know, Trevor, and it's time you figured out how to work with what you have instead of coming here to take what's mine." He stood up. He was quiet for a long time, and I couldn't read him. Then he said, "I need to go." I said okay. He drove back to Nashville. I washed both coffee cups this time. That was 4 months ago. The donation completed in December. Catherine handled everything cleanly. The transfer was tax-advantaged. Phil helped me structure it correctly, so it worked in my favor at year's end. Under IRS charitable contribution rules, I was able to deduct the full fair market value of the property since Lakeside Hope is a registered 501c3. It wasn't just the right thing to do. It was also, on paper, the smart thing to do. Doan sent me a photo in January. Some of the kids from the program were out on the dock, fishing. One of them, a kid about 16 or 17 with a bright orange jacket, was holding up a small bass like he'd caught something extraordinary. His face was lit up in a way I recognized. The way a person looks when they're somewhere they didn't expect to belong. I put the photo on my refrigerator. Pam called me that Sunday like she always does, and I told her what had happened. The full version, from Trevor's visit to the donation. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Dad, I think Mom would have done the exact same thing." I didn't say anything back for a moment. Then I said, "I think she'd have done it faster." Pam laughed, and it sounded so much like Darlene that I had to step out onto the back porch for a minute and look at the sky. Trevor texted me in February. Not a long text. It just said, "Britton and I are going to counseling. Lily Rose misses her grandpa. Can we come up sometime?" I wrote back, "Sunday works. I'll make chili. I don't know what's going to come next with my son. Maybe the counseling helps. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe we find our way back to something real. And maybe we don't. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you I have that figured out. I'm 61 years old and I've made enough predictions to know I'm not good at them. But I know this. I know that somewhere on Norris Lake there's a kid in an orange jacket who caught a small bass on a dock that used to be mine. And somewhere in Nashville, there's a man who's finally, maybe for the first time, going to have to learn how to stand on his own. I didn't give away my most valuable possession. I gave away a cabin. What I got back, I'm still counting. I've been thinking a lot lately about cause and effect. Not in any grand, cosmic sense, just the plain, practical kind. The kind where you look back at a chain of events and you can see, clear as a roadmap, exactly how one thing led to the next. Trevor didn't end up on my doorstep demanding that cabin out of nowhere. That morning was the last link in a chain that started years before, and some of those early links, I'll be honest, I helped forge. When Darlene was sick, I worked instead of sitting with the discomfort of watching someone I loved suffer. That was a failure of courage, dressed up as responsibility. Trevor saw his father disappear into overtime shifts, and he learned something from that. Not the lesson I intended, but the one I actually taught. That when things get hard, you find a way out of the room. He spent the next 20 years doing exactly that. A failed restaurant, a dissolved partnership, a leveraged warehouse he couldn't sustain. Always moving, always starting over, always looking for the exit before the walls closed in. I'm not saying I caused all of that. A man makes his own choices, but I'm also not pretending I had nothing to do with it. What I know now, at 61, is that the most important thing a person can build isn't a business or a savings account. It's the ability to stay in the room, to sit with something hard and not flinch away. Trevor never learned that, and the reason he came to me for the cabin instead of finding another way forward was because, somewhere deep down, he still believed that someone else should absorb the consequence of his choices. That's not cruelty. That's just a man who was never asked to carry his own weight long enough to develop the muscle for it. The decision I made, to give that property to Lakeside Hope instead, wasn't about punishing him. I want to be clear about that. Because I think people sometimes confuse firmness with anger. I wasn't angry. I was tired, and I was clear. There's a difference. Anger wants the other person to hurt. Clarity just knows what the right thing is and does it regardless of the reaction. I looked at that cabin, and I looked at Don's kids. Teenagers with no soft landing, no father to call, no spare key to anyone's house. And the math was simple. Trevor had options. Those kids didn't. There's something I've come to believe, and it didn't come from any book or sermon. It came from 32 years of showing up to the same job, from watching Darlene face the end of her life with more dignity than I'll probably ever manage, from sitting on a cold porch in October, watching a heron stand absolutely still at the edge of a lake. What I believe is this: character isn't what you do when things are easy. It's what you do in the 60 days before you lose everything, when you're tempted to take the shortcut that costs someone else instead of you. Trevor is in counseling now. He texted me about it himself, which took something. I don't know what comes next for him. I'm not going to pretend fatherhood comes with a guarantee. But I know that the kindest thing I ever did for my son wasn't any check I wrote or cosign I offered. It was the morning I sat across from him at that kitchen table and told him the cabin was gone, and meant it. Because for the first time in a long time, I treated him like a man who was capable of figuring it out. I hope I was right about that. I think I was. What I got back, I'm still counting.